Andrew Gilmour is a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, currently works in conflict resolution. Good morning to you, Andrew.
Good morning.
Welcome back, John Lyndon, who was with us the other day. It's so good to have you back, John, Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Hello, John.
Good morning.
And Adam Manit, welcome, Adam. I believe you have had family killed in the Hamas attack. I extend my sympathies to you, my condolences. What do you think about the Secretary General's comments, Adam?
Well, I mean, I think I found them very offensive. The role of the UN should be about promoting peace and security, not trying to provide moral cover for the acts of terrorists.
In what way is this moral cover?
Well, he's contextualizing the atrocities that were committed on October 7th. His remarks will be a music to the ears of despots and tyrants everywhere, who will now be finding all sorts of excuses and reasons to justify horrendous acts, to cover themselves, and to justify their actions.
I suppose his argument would be, and the argument of others would be, that everything has a root cause, even the most heinous act of horrifying, sadistic terror, which is what we saw in Israel. There is a root cause to everything.
Well, I would disagree with that. There's an excuse for everything. Some people can take that excuse and accept it and be persuaded by it, or you could reject it because it's not legitimate. And I think this is what's happening here. Is there's an excuse being made for the horrendous atrocities. I should remind people that this is about babies being killed, ripped out of their mothers' stomachs, bodies burned. I mean, one of the worst atrocities and massacres the worst atrocity and massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. For anyone to suggest that this has some kind of contextualization that can begin to excuse it is frankly unnerving, especially coming from the Secretary General of the United Nations.
So what was your emotional reaction when you heard what he had said?
I was fuming. I mean, I was livid. This is, Guterres' own remarks a few years ago was that anyone who called for Israel's destruction was ipso facto anti-Semitic. And here he is now contextualizing a terrorist organization prescribed as such by numerous democracies around the world as having a contextual basis by which it carried out its atrocities. This is the same organization that in its founding charter, calls for the destruction of Israel. So by his own definition is anti-Semitic. Here he is now providing moral cover of some degree for their actions, and I find that abhorrent. And he should step down. He has clearly lost the plot and has no credibility left.
Adam, let me ask you another couple of things, and then we'll bring in Andrew and John as well. He also said, Mr. Guterres, that the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas.
He did, but then he also prefaced what he said by talking about the occupation. Hamas is not under occupation. Gaza is not under occupation. So he again is trying to justify the actions by saying that there's some provocation that deserved it. Now, this is just an abhorrent remark, especially from the Secretary General of the United Nations. There is no occupation of Gaza. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Hamas took over. The United Nations has consistently demonized Israel throughout for decades now. It's a standing agenda item in the United Human Rights Council. There's an open-ended commission of inquiry, which one of its members has made anti-Semitic remarks about a Jewish lobby and the power of the Jewish lobby. We have special rapporteurs who have made numerous anti-Semitic remarks. They have no credibility here, and they're completely running counter to their own charter.
Let me bring you in here, Andrew Gilmour, to respond to what we've heard from Adam, former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Some really powerful points to address. Andrew Gilmour.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I share, similarly to you, I convey my condolences to Adam for his loss. And I also agree with him that, of course, it is the worst massacre of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. And I totally understand why the feeling in Israel amongst its supporters is so appalled, shocked, and aghast at what is going on, and why there is this extraordinary desire, understandable in many ways, to take revenge. But I think I disagree with almost everything else he said. Well, first of all, Gaza is under
Nobody's
occupation.
taking revenge. This is not about revenge. This is about eliminating a terrorist organization that has just committed an atrocity in Israel's borders. No country would tolerate that.
3,000 children have just been killed by Israel. Absolutely.
According to Hamas's health ministry, we don't know the actual numbers. And of course, Israel has done everything it could to get civilians out of harm's way. It has flyered the entire north of Gaza, asking people to leave, trying to remove people away from civilian areas where Hamas is currently operating, because Hamas doesn't care about civilian lives.
Adam, my friend, can I respectfully just ask you to give a couple of minutes, 3 minutes space to Andrew to respond to the points, and then I give you my word I will come back to you.
No, that was extraordinary, and I was allowed to speak for 20 seconds anyway. Thank you. So Gaza is under occupation. Israeli troops pulled out in 2005, but under the absolute definition of under international law, the UN and other bodies regard it as under occupation because Israel controls the borders, and it stops people coming out and it stops things coming in. It controls the airspace, it controls the sea space, it controls virtually everything. Israel is under occupation, even if Israeli troops are not inside it. Point one. Number two, as we have said, the Secretary General did measure his words extremely careful. He quite rightly said nothing justifies the appalling massacre that Hamas carried out. But also he pointed out that nothing happens in a vacuum, and nothing does happen in a vacuum. And he also talked about the epic suffering, and what the Gazan people are going through is indeed epic in terms of suffering. In terms of war crimes as well, there is very, very clear. He's not on the ground, but he can see Israeli statements. Israelis have told 1 million Gazan people, including people in hospitals who are unable to move, who are disabled, that they have to move. Forcible relocation is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. The imposition of collective punishment is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. Stopping food, and as the Israeli Ministry of Defense has said, we are stopping water, food, and fuel going in. All of those are war crimes. So the Israelis are themselves testifying to the fact that they are committing war crimes just by announcing that the actions they are doing. So all of these things. And if I could just make one other point before I get interrupted, just to say this is a long context. The Secretary General is right to have talked about the long occupation of 56 years. But even before that, there was trouble. In 1956, the Secretary General's predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, told the Israeli Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, that exactly, this is a quotation now, you, Israelis, are convinced that your actions will stop further Palestinian incidents. I am convinced they will lead to further. And you believe that this is the way of creating respect for Israel, will pave the way for sound coexistence with the Arabs. And I believe, the Secretary General in 1956, I believe that the policy may postpone indefinitely the time for such coexistence. So this
Let me ask you a question before we bring Adam back in, and also John, and we've got calls. At the time of 7/7 in this country and 9/11 in New York, the atrocity of the Twin Towers, if anyone said, "Oh well, you can understand why they did it," it would have been a pretty ludicrous thing to say. How can you? I suppose that's the point, isn't it? That the Israeli officials are making, and that Adam is making this morning, is that given the atrocities that we've seen, the barbarity that was carried out, the appalling, sickening scenes, what they actually did, what can possibly justify behaviour like that? And for some, it appears that the UN Secretary General is saying something can and has justified that. Andrew Gilmour, can't you understand, given that interpretation, how offensive that is to people?
Yes, but he said categorically nothing justifies that action. He couldn't have been more clear on that point, but he also says it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And what he's trying to do desperately, is to reduce the suffering of 2.2 million Palestinian civilians. And they are being bombed. They are having no medical assistance. They are being told to move to places, and then they get bombed when they move there. He is trying desperately to get humanitarian aid in to reduce the sufferings. He pointed out that nothing happens in a vacuum, and there was a background to it. And of course, we understand. I have lived in Israel, I have lived in Gaza, and I absolutely get why there is this extraordinary frustration and anger on the part of Gazans and indeed West Bankers, which does not justify the murderous actions, but it does give some background to it. And to pretend there is background it's just ridiculous, actually. I'm sorry to say.
I'll let Adam come back, and John with you too. Mark and Reading coming up, and Sadiq in Birmingham. That's the key phrase, isn't it, Adam? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Ain't that the truth?
Well, no, it's not the truth. I mean, the thing is that Hamas is explicitly founded on the premise that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, that it is committed to the full and utter destruction of the state of Israel, and in addition to that, that it is committed to the slaughter and murder of all Jews worldwide. That's in its founding charter. So we can talk semantics about vacuums and context, but that's the context of Hamas. And so when everyone is calling for a ceasefire or, telling us that, we can't respond to what Hamas have just enacted upon us, the greatest massacre since the Holocaust of Jews. And I should add, numerous Arab Israelis have also been killed by their actions. I don't know what to tell you. That's the vacuum. There's a moral vacuum at the UN. There's a moral vacuum by any commentator who justifies the actions of resistance against Israelis, which we saw on the streets of London. We saw on the streets here in Brighton, people celebrating these acts. And frankly, I think people need to check their moral compass. It seems to be broken.
Let me bring in Mark in Reading and Sadiq in Birmingham. John, I'll be right with you as well. We've got so much to think about and to talk about. Sadiq, good morning. Sadiq, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Right. Say what you want to say, then we'll go to Mark in Reading. Carry on, Sadiq.
Right. So basically, I left a text voice note. The reality is, what we're seeing now is a situation, you started from 1948, where we are right now. We can't just talk about the 7th of October. I do condemn it. We can't just talk about 7th of October. This is an ongoing problem. And it's always been backed by America. It's always been backed by Britain. At the end of the day, they started this conflict. How? Because they gave Palestinian land away. The Palestinian people are occupied. Everybody knows it's an occupation. Can you imagine if, in 1982, the British did give up Argentina? What would people be saying then? No, we were into a war to take back the Falkland Islands. So you can clearly see that when things have been taken by force, people are going to retaliate. There's going to be a vacuum of hatred. They've created, for 17 years, a zoo/prison. People can't come in, come out. People are not allowed to just freely move. It's not a country, because there's no airport. They don't have a port right next to the actual Mediterranean Sea. What the Israelis are doing is, in the 21st century, allowing the world to see we are getting away with everything. We're absolutely going to get away with it because we control media, we control the narrative, we control everything.
Control
about
media?
What
Hang on. Who controls media?
What I mean is, you, Nicky, may say what you want to say. But the reality is, every single person that's come on the television has to condemn. I mean, look,
Well, sorry,
if I saw a rapist rape someone...
Who controls the media?
If I saw a rapist rape someone... No, let me finish. If I saw a rapist rape someone...
Question. I just want to pick up that point.
Actually start condemning and
because
saying,
it is
I'm sorry.
It's an anti-Semitic trope, isn't it? I just want to check it out with you. Who controls the media?
Well, let's look at the reality of what the narrative is here. It's every single time Palestinians are problems. Palestinians are problems. Every time it's the Palestinians are problem. Have you actually spoken to Palestinians? They don't even support Hamas.
Yes.
They don't really like Hamas. They're forced into a situation with Hamas.
So who controls the media?
Like Hamas. You understand? So the reality who we're looking at a situation is that whenever anyone comes onto the media, they have to start condemning what Hamas has done. Everyone condemns it. But do we condemn other groups in the past? No, we don't. That's the problem. We just, the reality is, everybody who's seeing the situation can clearly see violations are happening, left, right, and centre. Violations towards, we're talking about innocent people, 2.6 million people, the size of Birmingham. Imagine the size of Birmingham only allowed 500 trucks a day for food. I mean, we're going to be on the brink of starvation. At one point, people are going to get fed up and they're going to go into a fit of rage. We've seen that happen in this country.
Sadiq, thank you. I want to give everybody a fair shot. Thank you very much indeed. Mark in Reading. Hi, Mark.
Hi. So much I could contest Sadiq with on the creation of the State of Israel, and I'm not actually going to even go down that road. But if you wanted to, the UN created the State of Israel, and it was backed by France, Britain, USSR, and the USA. So Sadiq, check some of that history, please. In ref to Gutierrez, yes, he's wrong. He's taken a partisan stance. I had a look at what his history was. It doesn't strike me as odd that he said what he said. He's a foot soldier of the left, having been and still am considering himself left of centre. The Gramscian creep into these organisations is impossible to ignore. I want peace. I don't. I think you called it out with Andrew Gilmour, which is, I have heard people say about 9/11 that it was just desserts for the USA. It was the haves versus the have-nots. So I have heard people say that, and I'm afraid I think the UN has just become a grievance body, and we hold Israel to standards which we will not hold China to account for. Where is the protests on the streets for the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority that are being persecuted in China? Oh, it doesn't fit with our narrative because we always want cheap Chinese goods. We're holding Israel to higher account, and it's an inverse form of racism. There you go.
And because China has strong economic links with Turkey and with other countries as well.
Yeah, but
I'm just saying, people who make the argument that you're making say, follow the money.
Well, absolutely. I agree, but where's the anti-Chinese protests? Which group of victims do people want to walk for this week? And every time I ever watch the protests, all I see is the socialist worker banners. I remember these clowns trying to sell me newspapers when I went to sixth form college, were telling me that evils of Zion and stuff like that. It's absolute nonsense. So I followed that line, hook, line and sinker, till really about 5 years ago. And
what about the point made by Antonio Guterres that there are clear violations of international law taking place in Gaza? We heard this from Sadiq, our last caller, describing very graphically the suffering of the Palestinian people. What's your answer to that point?
I think I'd said right at the beginning I'm pro-peace, and if violations of war crime, violations of human rights and war crimes happen, then there is an international court that could hold these people to account. That's the line that we have to tread. Why didn't Hamas attack military pieces in just across the Gaza Strip? Why did it attack unarmed people? I don't condone land steal on the West Bank. But you know what? A genocide is funny when you have 1 million people living in Gaza Strip in 2000 and you've got 2 million now. That's a funny genocide when you double the amount of people.
Thank you. Two very powerful callers, Sadiq and Mark. John Lyndon, Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East peace. What I was so impressed with continually with your good self is that your ability to grasp the nuance of the situation, the arguments on both sides, to understand the historical context, to understand the political context, to understand the personal tragedies that have happened and how they have affected the national psyche and individuals. What do you make of this row about Antonio Guterres, John?
Well, thank you, Nicky. First of all, I mean, the attempt to introduce context is always going to be incredibly traumatic at a moment when both Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs internationally are feeling a profound sense of trauma. And I think Secretary General Guterres made a mistake in not contextualizing the Israeli perception right now as well in the same statement. I think he has a very varied group of stakeholders. If you think your job is hard, he has 193 member states of the United Nations, who I think people don't appreciate are incredibly divided on this issue. And it has a kind of north-south axis. So he, I think, was trying to, and again, I'm now adding context and perhaps I'm in a difficult position. I expect what he was trying to do was to channel the frustrations of much of the global south. And I've been following some of the debates and they're very different to what we're hearing in the UK and in the West. And I think what he should have done simultaneously, if I'm very honest, is then channel the concerns of Israelis and Jews and a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere to those constituencies in the global south. There was an opportunity here to be able to really explain two sides of an increasingly polarized geopolitical context to each other. But I also wanted to sort of zoom out and look at the other people who have spoken who have not received the same level of criticism. So there's 5 members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, and China and Russia, who are 2 of those permanent members, who have come in for nowhere near the same level of condemnation, have been far more, the generous word would be ambivalent about what happened than Secretary General Guterres, who did condemn Hamas's attack. China didn't mention Hamas at all. They simply gave a sort of general statement around civilian lives. President Putin in Russia did condemn the attacks individually, but then pushed a Security Council resolution a week ago that didn't. And he also personally equated what was going on in Gaza to the Nazi siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. Now, all of those things are a lot more objectionable in my view. And I don't want to make this a partisan thing, but I feel as if the United Nations, because of its checkered history with regards to engagement on this issue.
But you would expect nothing less of China and China and Russia at the moment. The permanent members, of course, UK, US, France, Russian Federation, and China. You'd expect Russia to say that. It's no surprise. It's no surprise China have taken that stance or taken that position of ambivalence. People might argue that you would expect more of the Secretary General. What should he have said then?
So I think he should have explained how, number one, how Israelis are feeling, because I don't think that's understood. I'm generalizing here enormously, but across the global south and amongst communities of people who are pro-Palestinian in general. And I think that the chasm is widening. There was probably a little bit more understanding in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. But now the space for empathy or understanding and not acceptance. There is going to continue to be divisions over what is taking place right now. But I feel like people are misunderstanding the base motivations of both people and allowing dehumanization to grow that is targeting both Jews, Israelis and Palestinians at the moment. And I think there was an opportunity for Secretary General Guterres to actually speak to both of his divided international constituencies to explain. I mean, your earlier caller, Adam, I mean, put what happened and I think in more appropriate context than President Putin did, in the context of the Shoah and the Holocaust for Israelis and for Jews. And that is the context within the greatest civilian massacre since the Holocaust is being felt by Jews. And I think it's important that people understand that. And I think it's simultaneously important for people to understand that Palestinians are currently perceiving what's happening in Gaza in the context of the Nakba, right? The greatest catastrophe in Palestinian history. Now, you don't have to agree that either of those emotional responses are objectively valid. You just need to understand that they are very sincerely held and they are near universal amongst Jews and Palestinians right now. And I think there is a way for somebody in a seat like Secretary General Guterres to take on the role of explaining that to people. And it does provide, again, that difficult word, context for what we're seeing. And I think that emotional context is actually almost as important as the political context that he sought to explain.